Just a brief introduction to myself. I'm Scott Stevens. I work at UC Berkeley. I'm a professor of fire science, fire ecology. Been there now about 21 years. So it's really been an interesting time. It's gone very quickly. Worked for the Forest Service Research Station, Pacific Southwest Research Station, for 2 years right after I finished my PhD. Then I was a professor at Cal Poly San Luis Obispo in their forestry program for 3 years. So been working in fire in the Sierra Nevada and other places. And today would love just to talk to you about some of the things we've learned from Blodgett and a little bit of information from elsewhere. I know that the Zoom setting world is challenging. I start teaching a 210 person class in the last Wednesday of August. The whole thing's going to be on Zoom. I'm not looking forward to it, actually. I'm looking forward to teaching, but I really like to be in a classroom with students. So I don't know. I think that certainly this is still important, but it'd be nice if we were in person. But today, we'll talk about the science behind forest restoration in the Sierra Nevada. That's what our goal is. And do we want to do questions along the way, or do we want to wait it to the end?
If you want to just, I'll leave it to you. We have 75 minutes. If you feel like there are natural stopping points, I'll leave it to you. You might want to pause and check in.
Yeah. Well, I really prefer that. You know, it'd be nice to have a couple pauses, you know, so
Great.
That way you could ask some questions. And if you could help facilitate the questions, Tanya, that would be really nice if possible.
Oh, I certainly will. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, you seem to be a great facilitator. We just met. So I just want to connect to a past for a moment. In 1956 here, you see this is National Geographic. And the title of this National Geographic piece, Our Green Treasury, the National Forest, by Nathaniel Kenny. I find this publication to be very interesting. The whole publication, maybe it's around 25 pages or so, 30 pages, is all about the National Forest in 1956. And one thing about this publication that I always find really intriguing, it really pushes the idea that science is going to solve literally almost all problems in forests. And it talks about it from many aspects: entomology, timber, fire. So it puts up this kind of really strong narrative of just how science eventually is just going to be able to help us understand and solve all questions. You know, I think that's totally wrong. You know, science is no doubt going to help us answer questions, but I think the biggest issue is people in the land. It's people in the way they basically interact with the land. So it's not just that science is going to have a breakthrough, new technology. All this is useful. I think sometimes frankly, as a scientist and someone that writes a lot of papers, I think we diverge a little bit sometimes and think about how we're going to move forward without this idea of land ethic and people and land working together. Well, here's a quote from this 1956 publication. As one fire expert told me, I don't believe that equipment and development alone will show us how to keep having the relatively few big fires. Researchers must let their imagination soar for answers that today would seem fantastic. So there's a quote from 56. You know, in some ways that could be 2020. So, and I think that's really interesting to look back, you know, and see how others had been thinking about issues relative to fire, forest management. And here we see right here in 56, people are calling for this idea of researching new ideas and let your imagination soar to find answers. We're gonna look at that very question at the very end of my talk today. So we'll come back to it. So just a little bit of background. Yeah, and I think many of you probably have seen pictures and know of studies, but just to look at some of the ideas. Show and Kotak were very instrumental in developing early information for California forests and also information that eventually became policy at the national level. So this turns out to be a picture of the Bear Creek Guard Station on the Plumas National Forest. It was actually a picture taken in 1915. So you can see a very open, pine-dominated area with some shrubs understory. And Show and Kotak write several papers. 1924, they write one, California pine forest represents broken, patchy understock stands worn down by the attrition of repeated light fires. So one of their quotes. Extensive crown fire almost unknown to the California pine region, and the virgin forest subjected to repeated surface fires for centuries has been exposed to cumulative risk. So, you know, very explicit writings of their observations and research. I found a really remarkable paper written by Shao at the end of his life. He was asked by the National Forest chief to actually write a kind of autobiography. And he actually wrote in the about mid 50s a whole kind of summary of his whole career. It's about 300 pages. And I've read that thing several times, and there's a lot of nuggets in there about how they basically looked at fire early, how they were trying to figure out how to manage fire. They frankly were very biased against fire. His writings are just flat extensive on this. He just tells us how, they were trying to do research on fire effects and prescribed burning at the time. In fact, they did. A place called Snake Lake on the Plumas National Forest turned out to be a real center of that early research. But frankly, they didn't give fire a fair shake. They didn't give it a fair shake in the 20s, the teens, to look at maybe it could have been useful. They did do some work, but that could be a whole nother conversation. But if you look at their extensive writings in the 20s, they open this idea of kind of what the pine mixed conifer forest used to be. So of course, we all know that fire suppression becomes a policy around 1905. It certainly varies depending on different parts, even of this state, in terms of effectiveness. 1905, we know, was the creation of the U.S. Forest Service, Gifford Pinchot. And Pinchot certainly was a leader that thought fire needed to be managed and removed from ecosystems. If you look today, just at our national database, we get about 80,000 fires a year on average. This varies from 75,000 to 100,000, and these are wildland fires. So we're talking about fires in forests, shrublands, and grasslands. And 98 to 99% of all wildland fires are put out less than 5 acres in size on almost every single year. And you think about that. I mean, that is phenomenal, frankly. Okay, 98, 99% out 5 acres or smaller. That's initial attack. That's a trained workforce, early detection, mobile resources, a lot of things going on, but 98 to 99% are out. But the conundrum is the 1 to 2% of the fires that burn every year generally burn around 95% of the area. So you have a fire system that is really good at getting out the vast majority of fires, but the few fires that unfortunately get large are the ones that really modify our landscapes. That's happening today, of course, with all the lightning fires that have happened and overwhelmed resources in some areas, and some of these fires, unfortunately, have gotten large. Human-caused fires are also incredibly important because we get more of those in the state, especially around human communities. So I did a paper back in 2007 with a couple co-authors. So we estimated what happened in California in terms of fire, trying to get just a sense of how much fire used to burn in California. Well, before 1800, we estimated about 1.1 million acres of forest burn annually. 1.1 million acres of forest. The Klamath, the Sierra Nevada, the Southern California mountains, so everywhere, about 1.1 million acres of forest. And a conservative number for the amount of area burned in California on an average year turned out to be around 4.5 million acres. Over half of that with indigenous burning. So lightning fire and indigenous burning, coupled them together, 4.5 million acres. And that, frankly, that's a conservative number. We actually had another estimate in that same paper that actually is about 3 times higher. But the conservative number was actually the one that kind of stuck with the public and others. So about 1 million acres of forest burning a year, at least 4.5 million acres burning in California on an average year. And today we burn, even on the worst years, about 25% of that area. Sometimes 10%, 25%. So, that is just a background. Again, I would never say that we're going to go back to those numbers. California certainly changed in ways that you all know. Things that have urbanization, we have road systems, agriculture, all sorts of things going on. So we're not going to do 4.5 million acres anymore. But I always like to talk about that just to give a sense of what fire used to do to the place we call California today. We're called the Golden State. I call us the Pyro State. When you think of the way fire used to modify the ecosystems of this state, it was essential. Harold Biswell, who was a professor at Berkeley from 1947 to 72, he had a famous quote. He said, fire was almost as important as rain and soil to the ecosystems of California. That's what Biswell said. Almost as important. So that to me is just remarkable in terms of just the backdrop of how fire used to occur in this state and what it used to do. Maybe just for a moment, I could certainly ask any questions, or anybody wants to make a comment. I'd be happy to hear it.
Any thoughts or questions for Dr. Stevens so far?
This is Rich Farrington. I just want to be clear on what the 4.5 million acres are relative to the 1.1. Can you just go over that again?
Sure, I'm happy to, Rich. Yeah, the 4.5 includes all ecosystems. So it includes the grasslands, the oak woodlands, the wetlands. So it really includes all ecosystems of California. So the 1.1 million is basically roughly about 1/4 of that was forest, and the other 3/4 were other vegetation types. And of course, indigenous burning was so monumental and is still important. A lot of times I keep talking about indigenous burning as in the past, and I always have to stop. Because, you know, there's a lot of indigenous cultures out there right now working to get fire back on land and trying to actually work on these systems. So by no means do I always want to say that indigenous burning is always something in the past. It's not. But yeah, so that 4.5 million is all ecosystems, and the 1.1 we estimated was just the forest component.
Sue, do you have a question?
Yeah, on the indigenous, hi Scott, on the indigenous burning, any sense, you know, quantifying the land covered by that, those ignitions? Can you point to any surveys or assessments or estimates of that?
Well, that's a great question, Sue, and it's a very difficult one. You know, right now, actually, ARB in Sacramento is updating the amount of area burned and results in emissions for a baseline because of legislation passed by the state last year. I'm actually part of that science committee that's doing that update. And we spend many minutes and hours on phone calls and Zooms talking about your very question. So they've engaged more indigenous scholars, Frank Lake and others. And the way I did it, I just read the literature. I tried to look at Kat Anderson's work, look at other work that actually talked about the amount of amount of frequency. So a lot of work from indigenous people talk about ideas of how much burning used to occur by vegetation type, but then taking that into area, of course, is a little challenge, because does that mean you equate it equally throughout the state? Some areas may be more accessible, more able to actually have indigenous fire regimes. So I think all I know what to do is to try to get the best information from indigenous scholars and indigenous people, and then try to then apply that information as best you can to an area estimate, which is actually very difficult.
Yeah. Well, it's great that you guys are working with ARB, and it'll be very interesting to see what comes out of that. So thanks.
Yeah. One quick caveat about that paper, it was actually rejected 3 times. The Stevens et al. 2007, it was rejected 3 times. The first 2 rejections were for Conservation Biology Journal. And then the third rejection was from Ecosystems, the journal Ecosystems. Eventually it got published in the Forest Ecology and Management. The first 3 rejections were that the people that reviewed it and the editors believed that I needed to remove the indigenous component. This is no joke. They just basically said it was too uncertain, you know, somehow that it probably didn't happen, you know, that this is really more historical versus scientific. So I just refused to not have an indigenous component in that paper. I thought it was the right thing to do, and I still do. But there's a real bias, I hate to say, to the ideas of indigenous management, I think. And I think we're doing better on it, but it's one that I think is pervasive. So what about some historical data? So how have forests changed? There's a picture, of course, of a lot of boxes and data. So this is the San Bruno Federal Archive. This is not a picture of the archive, but it looks a little like this. So this is a place in San Bruno, California, where they hold a whole bunch of federal records of data. And it turns out, if you go in there and you get a little lucky, you can find some forms like this one. This is a USDA, Department of Agriculture. You see up in the upper left-hand corner, form 321A. The 321A was a form that was actually used to actually record data for early forest inventories. So what you see on the top, YP yellow pine, SP sugar pine, WF white fir, each column is a species, And then you have your dots in there essentially showing you the size of trees by size class. Size classes are relatively small, and these data forms are phenomenal. They give you essentially the information from forest inventory that was actually connected to the public land survey. So it's connected to section corners. And you can then see this information. This one you can see on the top was actually collected 7-8-1911. So this particular one comes from the Groveland district of the Stanislaus. So we've been fortunate to actually find some of these records. And here's a couple places where we found records, one from the Stanislaus National Forest, and then another one from what was then the Kern National Forest, which is now today part of the Sequoia National Forest. We've also found two other sites, one in the El Dorado near the King Fire. And the last one we're actually just about ready to finish, a little bit different format, but the largest data we found is actually in the Southern Cascades near Lake Amador. So we've analyzed these to try to get a sense of what forest inventory information was back around 1911, 1920. And you can see some things there in terms of number of trees and surveyed acres. Turned out to be around 3 to 5% sample of the area, which is a relatively high sample rate. Okay, and here I'll just show you a few pictures. It turned out that I was out with a crew that I had hired at UC Berkeley to do some remeasurement of some of these areas on the Groveland. And you can see maybe that's 15 July 2003. So we're out there using the public survey system. We're at a section corner, and we're actually doing a resurvey of a site that was recorded in 1911. Probably some of you remember what happened in 2013 in the Stanislaus, a very large fire, the rim fire. So take a look at that big old log on the ground. It turned out I was there taking a few photographs, and then here's a picture in September. So that turns out to be a picture after the rim fire. Okay, so we can see essentially, you know, high mortality in this particular patch. And of course, we see that large log that's been burned. And the next picture just is a few years later. So here's that same picture of the rim fire that actually occurred a few years later. And we see some certainly native shrubs coming back. There's some shrubs and grasses in the foreground. There are a few trees. If you actually go out there and look around, the number of trees though are very, very low. And this, of course, is one of the fires that gives us great concern. We see patches of high severity fire that kills over 90% of the trees that are very large. And then this has a strong ability to remove seed sources. A couple more pictures of that particular inventory. So on the left, you can see I took a couple pictures of a couple old growth ponderosa pines. I remember talking to the students how important these trees were. You know, these trees are probably close to 300 years old, 250. And on the right, of course, is after the King Fire, excuse me, the rim fire. And you can see both those trees, unfortunately, had died. And here's another picture I took with the students, and you can see there's a California black oak back there in the background. And you can see it's completely surrounded by ingrowth of generally white fir and some incense cedar. And on the right side, you see after the rim fire again, all the conifers had died. And in fact, that oak, it sprouted from the base, but the top of it was completely killed. And when you look at an oak like that, it also gives you, I think, a real connection to indigenous cultures, because we know that the California black oak was critical and is still a critical food supply for indigenous communities. So when that oak was thriving a couple 100 years ago, there's no way that it had all those crazy trees at its base. Okay, saying indigenous management would have kept that oak open, would have actually allowed acorn collection, would have actually kept the tree alive. And of course, this is just another example of how these systems have changed. I'll give a quick summary of some data here, and then maybe we'll pause for a moment. So if you look at 1911 on the Stanislaus Yosemite historical transects that we have, we see that the basal area, feet squared per acre in 1911 was around 90 square feet per acre. And in 2013 was around 170 square feet per acre on average. And then you look at the tree density, 1911, trees over 6 inches around 22, trees over 36 inches around 5 trees per acre. And then in 2013, the number of trees about 100 over 6. And the pine proportion shifts away from pine to more fir. So another thing we could see actually is 1911 canopy cover. And we have to look at this. We had to create this from FVS. We use FVS to actually estimate canopy cover from a tree list. Estimates around 25% canopy cover, but that 25% value is over a 40-acre area. The 40-acre area was something called the lot, and that is the scale of the measurement. We get the tree list for 40 acres. We don't get a tree list for 1 acre 40 times. We get one list of trees for 40 acre, and if you use that and estimate canopy cover, you see an average around 25%, and variation in there, of course. But the average for the 40-acre lot was a canopy cover about 25%. And there's a couple of papers. Maybe I'll stop here just for a moment in case anybody wants to ask a question.
Ben Solveski, you have a comment in the chat. Do you want to just say it verbally?
Yeah, so Scott, you show that basal area of 87, 1911 versus 173. Will you talk more about the change in basal area? Because I thought it was my understanding that basal area out of all the forest metrics is one of the few that is under current conditions is similar to historical conditions. Is this something different that's going on the Stanislaus 1911 data versus other places?
Mm-hmm.
Just would you speak more to that?
Sure. No, that's a very interesting question. And we're able to have some information that helps us with that, because I mentioned a moment ago that we did a study in the El Dorado, but the El Dorado study for the surveys was higher elevation. This one we've classified as pine mixed conifer, a little lower elevation, but the El Dorado study is fir mixed conifer. So it's dominated by white fir, a little bit of red fir, but also sugar pine and other aspects. When we look at the pine mixed conifer sites, including the Stanislaus, including the Kern River down the Sequoia, and including the area of the Southern Cascades that we haven't published yet, but Brandon Collins is very close to actually submitting, we find that the numbers of basal area in those three sites all are very close to the number we see right here. But if we go to the El Dorado site, which is higher elevation, fir-dominated mixed conifer, your comment is really correct. The basal area there didn't change much. So the fir mixed conifer site basal area is relatively similar between historic versus today, but in the pine dominated mixed conifer sites now that we have 3 of extensive surveys, we see a very low mixed conifer basal area in these sites. And that's been consistent with the 3 sites. Good question. Maybe we'll pop along here so I can show you a few other things. So forest management implications, contemporary stand replacing fires outside historic range of variability. So the patches of high severity. I never really get worried too much about area. Of course, the rim fire was 250,000 acres, and that's a huge fire, don't get me wrong. But I'm always asking, what's going on inside? What's going on? How much of the area is being burned under low severity, mixed severity? What are the sizes of high severity patches? That's the thing that gets you really information we need, because it's the high severity patches that are large. What's large? Hundreds of acres or bigger. Maybe 100 acres is okay once in a while, but hundreds and hundreds of acres or larger, that's outside of anything I think is resilient. Most pronounced, these patches in the yellow pine and the mixed conifer types. Patch sizes are important, not just the percentage of high severity, but the patch size. We just talked about that. So this idea of coordinated landscape treatments are ways that we try to go about mitigating uncharacteristic fire behavior and effects. Mark Finney and others say that if you do this strategically, around 15 to 20% of the landscape, you can actually get a benefit to both the landscape you're treating and also the area you don't treat. Of course, you got to actually put that in strategically. You've got to place the treatments in areas that basically have the highest potential for fire spread and intensity. Otherwise, you don't get that treatment effect. And none of these treatments are to stop a fire, not a single one. But you can modify its behavior and maybe be more effective around communities. And then you're trying to manage landscapes to incorporate fire in the long term. I don't see any other way that we can maintain. There was a good comment a moment ago about how do we maintain treatments into the future? How do we keep treating? How do we keep this conveyor belt going? Well, one part of the conveyor belt has to be more fire as maintenance in these treatments. I don't know how else we can do it because the scale of it's so large. So for a moment, maybe I'll take a look at ecological effects of the treatments, and we can stop for some more questions, please. Now we're headed to Blodgett. Blodgett Forest is in the northern Sierra Nevada. It's right there in the Georgetown district of the El Dorado National Forest. Back around 2000, I started a study called the Fire and Fire Surrogate Study. And this was a study to try to look at the similarities or differences between forest restoration techniques. So we had 3 controls where we didn't do any active treatment. We had 3 mechanical only stands where we basically just did a thin and mastication treatment with no burning at all. We had 3 prescribed fire only treatments where we just used prescribed fire without any manipulation beforehand. And we had 3 mechanical plus fire, the same mechanical treatment with fire afterwards. All the units around 50 acres in size, and the pre-treatment all had very similar hazards, and they're all relatively high. So I just want to show you now a set of photographs. And one thing that Jeff talked about early, it's the idea of going on the ground. So one thing I'd like to just say here, once we get through COVID, if you'd like, we'd be very happy to host a field trip at Blodgett for your group or anybody. We're always very happy to have people at this site to be able to just walk around. So I want to show you then just some photographs, and then we could stop and take a couple comments. So this is a pre-treatment, 2001. This is one of the stands that was randomly assigned a mechanical treatment. Mechanical treatment was a thin from below and also a crown thinning and a mastication of some birchable trees. And my little arrow there is pointing to a California black oak. We wanted to retain all the California black oak because we know it's important for wildlife. So here's pre-treatment 2001. Here comes a picture after treatment. Watch that oak in the corner. But first we all show you a picture of our masticator. So this is the mastication that's going on. So we got a rotary mounted masticator going through and actually masticating 90% of the trees below 10 inches diameter. Of course, we'd like to do this maybe with a biomass market or some other means that we could use this material. In early 2000s, in this part of the El Dorado, it was very difficult to have economic use for that type of material. So the masticator did the mastication and all material was left on site. This machine could do about 2 acres a day and costs around $600 an acre in 2000, probably a little higher today. So now we'll remember that oak tree in the upper right-hand corner, and there it is. So this is after our mechanical treatment. So you see the oak tree is still there. You see surface fuels in the foreground. You see a little bit of a mosaic of residual trees back there. One thing I would say, if I had to do this again, is I would try to actually increase spatial heterogeneity in the treatment versus a little bit more to average. Our marking guidelines and the way we did this work, we had essentially an ID team come in with wildlife biology, soil scientists, other people that just came in and tried to make a prescription the best we could, wildlife biologists. But the prescription is too homogeneous. I think we've learned more in the last 20 years to say that nice to get some spatial heterogeneity, little gaps, maybe some more areas of high forest density. We did leave 10% of the area in these systems untreated in patches. So 10% of these areas that received mechanical treatment did have patches of high density. So this is 2003. Let's go through time a little bit here. Next picture, 2010, 7 years. By 7 years, one thing that surprised me was the masticated and natural surface fuels had decomposed about 75%. I thought that material would have stayed on top of that ground for a lot longer, and it was heavy because we did not remove anything. So that mastication, one thing I think, the shreds of the masticated material, we had a mycologist come look at it, thought that it was very, very conducive to fungi that actually did decomposition on this material very efficiently because of its physical characteristics. Now let's go forward a little bit more, 2010, here we are 2015, there's the same tree. You can see some of that advanced regeneration, mostly incense cedar starting to grow again. So what do? We actually do another treatment, and there is the same tree on the upper right. So this is after the second thinning treatment and also mastication that just happened in 2019. So at the end of the day, we've done some research and published on this. I would argue this is a very effective treatment at both reducing fire hazard and increasing tree vigor, and has been relatively a good treatment. So, of course, we've kept a lot of the larger trees, but this is what our mechanical only sequence looks like after 2 entries over about a 20-year period. Let's look at some more pictures and then we'll take a break. So now we're going mechanical plus fire. So this is another pre-treatment photograph, and then there's a white fur there in the center. It's probably about 27 inches diameter or so, 26. So we're going to watch that tree. So this thing's going to still get the same mechanical treatment as the one we just saw, but afterwards we're going to do some burning. And you can, just as a rule of thumb, we're looking at about 30 tons of surface fuel per acre here, 30 tons, and about 30 tons of duff. Remember, the duff is a decomposed material on top of the soil. So we got about 30 tons of surface fuel, 30 tons of duff. We got around maybe 250 trees per acre. So I would call it a very typical place. This place has been commercially thinned for harvesting at least 3 times in the last 30 years. So I would call it somewhat typical of a lot of mixed conifer sites in the Sierra Nevada. So let's go forward. So we're headed forward. There's after our mechanical treatment. And you can see we've opened up the stand. We see some black oaks now in the background. We see an awful lot of activity fuel that's right there in front of us, including all those limbs with all those brown needles. And since this was a research study, we actually burned this thing the end of the year that this treatment was installed, which is not too bright. If I was to do this as a manager, I would have waited a year or two to let the snow and decomposition take out some of that flashy fuel, at least knock it down a little bit, compact it a little bit. But we actually burned the same year. And here's a picture of our fire. So we're doing a backing fire off the top, letting the backing fire just come through these stands as slow as possible. Flame lengths are about 1.25 meters. But the problem with this fire is the retention time and flaming combustion. It lasted around 20 minutes. So this thing was burning through a fuel bed with flames about that high, about 20 minutes before it actually consumed the fuel bed. That's a long time to put that kind of energy on residual trees. That's just a lot of heat. So after the fire, here's our same tree, dead center, and you can see we reduced around 80% of the surface fuels. And now we're going to go forward. So this is 2003. This was something that we weren't completely anticipating, an immense shrub response from the seed bank that was in the soil. The pre-data on this is deer brush or Ceanothus integrimus was less than 2% cover. Less than 2% cover in 2001. But we had this remarkable response of the Ceanothus after this treatment. And here's the next picture, shows us in 2015. This stuff got about 6 feet tall. And then we decided to go in and do another treatment. And here was the same tree. We did another mastication. So there's another mastication, and you can see there's a patch there left behind that actually the mastication didn't touch. Then we burned it again. This turns out to be not the exact spot of that tree, but this is the burn that we did again. And there's that same tree after the second mastication, thinning, and fire. I have to say, at the end of the day, it's been much harder for us to actually be successful in moderating fire behavior in this fuel bed. We killed more trees in this treatment than we'd hoped with this second fire. I think partly is because I think it's difficult to work with these shrubs. I mean, that's my experience. You know, even if I think, masticating, allow it maybe to decompose a little bit. We picked some times of day that we tried to burn that actually were on the low end of our prescription in terms of humidity and temperature. But again, I'm not saying I don't want to kill some trees, don't get me wrong. I'm very happy to kill trees with fire. But from this particular experience of mine, the last 20 years, I find that it's been a little more difficult for us to be more effective at maybe our overall goals with a mechanical plus fire treatment because we're having more damage to the residual stand than we actually anticipated. We'll talk about that maybe in a moment. I want to show you one more set of photos, then we're gonna stop. Now we're just going fire only. Okay, here's a big old sugar pine. That thing is 5 feet diameter. That's a big old tree. And you can see around it a lot of ladder fuels, a lot of surface fuel, that 30 tons per acre pre-treatment we talked about for surface. And we're going in, we're only going to use burning. Okay, so here's the fire in that same unit at night. So we're burning at night. You see some tan oak there. We see a lot of ladder fuels torching. There's a lot of live trees in the system that we're torching from these fires. Here's that sugar pine after the fire, the first fire, 2003. You can see it did a pretty good job of certainly reducing the surface fuel. And it actually we killed around 80% of the live trees that were below 10 inches diameter. And that was our goal. Our goal was to kill those trees. There's too many of them. So the fire was basically set up to try to kill those trees. We were relatively successful. But of course, you know, the biomass is still there. You're not taking the biomass off site. So let's go forward in time. 2009, we see some of that ceanothus come back from the seed bank. We also start to see some of the dead trees coming down there behind it. What do? We burn it again. So here's an ignition. I remember it being right here. I had my camera, I popped it out. That's that same sugar pine. Here's an ignition right in front of it. So that's the second fire, 2009. Here's after the second fire. So 2010, we start to see again, surface fuels low, some of the logs on the ground, still some of that residual standing biomass is still up. Here it is, 2017, more material on the ground, shrubs coming back. What do? We burn it again. So it's the third fire. So the third fire, 2017, comes through, and this is what it looked like in 2018. So that's the sequence of fires for this site. I would say at the end of this, we've a very desirable forest structure for many aspects. And now we're in a mode, I think we can maintain this by burning it maybe every 15, 20 years or so, maybe a little bit more variation in that if you'd like. And let's stop there for a moment. If anybody would have any comments about any of those photos or any questions.
Greg, and then Beverly. Greg, you might need to hit *6 on your keypad. Go ahead.
Good morning. Okay, thanks. Thanks, Dr. Stevens. My name's Greg. What were the size of these treatment plots on average?
Yeah, the size of these plots on average are around 60 acres. So not by any means very large.
And thank you. And that mechanical only, where you just masticated the material and you saw a significant decomposition over 7 years' time of the material. In your experience, would you say that's a conclusion that we should take away as ubiquitous across the Sierra Nevada? Or is it something that was more specific to Blodgett and the fungal flora there and the weather?
You know, that's a very, very good question. You know, I think if the masticator or whatever machine actually creates these shreds of material, these things are basically maybe about 10, 12 inches long, and they were very fibrous, very thin. So they had a very high surface area to volume ratio. I think potentially if we had material like that created, that I think the decomposition would be relatively rapid. No doubt Blodgett is a place that gets over 60 inches of rain a year. It's a pretty good site. So that probably is part of the factor. But I think if it was just round wood, if we'd done like a lop and scatter treatment or something else and just left that round wood on the ground where we didn't do mastication and kind of break it up, I believe that that material would have persisted for so much longer. That was probably at the first remeasure about 2009. That was the biggest surprise of the whole study. Just how fast that mechanical treatment surface layer had decomposed, and it really shocked us. I know Eric Knapp has worked on this a little bit as well, and a few other folks have worked on masticated fuel beds. So I guess I'd be a little hesitant to say, you know, for sure this would be applicable everywhere, but I do think if the machine can create a very high surface area to volume ratio and get that on the ground, it looks like the local fungi has the potential to really reduce its mass. That's been my experience.
Okay, can I ask one more question?
Sure.
So you sort of answered it a little bit when you were talking about the desired outcome of these plots, especially the mechanical only, where you did thin from below and then you did some crown thinning. Mm-hmm. And I started thinking, well, what were your targets for canopy cover outcomes and patchiness outcomes back then? Yeah. And you said, you know, 2020 hindsight, knowing what we know now, you would want to have to put in a little more heterogeneity. Can you go into that a little bit more about what were your targets then? Mm-hmm. Are we still sort of repeating those mistakes today, or have we improved? Are there lessons that we can take away? I know that there are lots of studies about the heterogeneity that we need, but what were your targets then that you would have changed today?
No, that's another great question. You know, I actually have a slide with the whole, it has everything, snags per acre, downwood per acre, basal area per acre, with prescription we were looking for. I don't have it right here in front of me, unfortunately, but it was a, you know, it was very I think it was fairly tight in terms of the basal area that we were shooting for, the number of trees per acre. And we did do, like you say, thin from below and a crown thinning. We did that to test empirically if we could see some benefit from the treatment. So first was the crown thinning. The crown thinning was actually set up that every dominant or co-dominant tree in the overstory would only have one neighbor intersecting the canopy. If it had more than one neighbor intersecting the canopy, then the idea was we would thin one of those trees. We would try to take the species that had the highest abundance. So if we had a lower abundance of ponderosa pine and sugar pine, those trees left, and the white fir and things like incense cedar and Doug fir came out. So after the prescription was done from the crown thinning, if you looked up into the canopy, we should see that no more than about one tree intersecting a dominant or co-dominant tree with the canopy. That resulted in a canopy cover afterwards of about 55%. It started around 75%. So from about 75% canopy covered, around 55% canopy cover after the crown thinning. Then we actually took fuel measurements after that and then ran it in our model to try to get a sense of how or whether or not it did anything to reduce fire behavior. And the result was that it really didn't do much in terms of reducing fire behavior. And I think we know that. The overstory trees are not a big part. They are a very small part of fire hazards in these forests. And when we did that crown thinning and actually then tried to do an evaluation, that's exactly what we found. That was followed by thinning from below and then the mastication treatment. And then we actually did another evaluation. And interestingly, because we increased the surface fuel load so much because of the mastication, it was a wash. So right after the treatment was implemented, the mechanical treatment, from at least a modeling standpoint, did not really give us much positive outcome in terms of potential fire behavior, because the surface fuel increase was offset by something like the ladder fuel decrease. So that's what we learned, at least from our mechanical treatment. And then in hindsight, what will we do differently? What I would do today, I would explicitly work in the prescription to have variation through the stands of 60 acres, 100 acres, 200 acres, whatever you got. I certainly would still think about the average conditions, like what we produce from our ID team, our state ID team. But then maybe I would do at least one standard deviation or two below that, and then one standard deviation maybe above that, and then vary that through the stand explicitly and do it deliberately. The stands at Blodgett today are way too homogeneous. Fire is starting to break them up a little bit, and it has. But when we look, I think, at the stand structure, basal area, tree density, I think they're still too homogeneous. And just like you've said, I think we've learned more in the last 20 years that say that more heterogeneity in these systems would be actually another attribute to enhance. I hope I answered your question.
Oh yeah, that's really cool. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Greg. So going on to David, and then Gwen in the chat, and then back to Ben. So David?
Thank you. How would your research apply to the Eastern Sierra? We are higher and drier. We've got areas where we have problems as well. But what lessons have you learned, et cetera, that would apply to our situation?
So are you maybe more Jeffrey pine, a red fir, and maybe, is that the forest type?
Yes, and as you go up, you're up in elevation, it's entirely fir.
Yeah. No, I think that's a good question. I think some of the concepts we're talking about right here, I think are very applicable to the Jeffrey pine mixed conifer forest at the east side. One place I've been working even longer, 25 years, is the Sierra Sympagea martyr down in northern Baja, California. That's this place that's had relatively little fire suppression. It started around 1970, and then it's had no harvesting at all. It's dominated by Jeffrey pine and also some sugar pine, white fir, and incense cedar. It's a dry site, just probably like you're talking about, a drier site. But I think the fundamentals are very similar. Maybe the target conditions would be even lower density than what we here have at Blodgett. But I do think that the ideas, the surface fuel reduction, the ladder fuels, and then also the crown fuel that we learned there, that they're not effective. And I think essentially that a lot of the stuff here has the ability to inform management in those types. We start popping up into the higher elevation fir forest, like the red fir, white fir. I think we got to have a different conversation. It really is a fundamentally different place. And I don't know of enough work that's happened there to test some of this stuff. So I think I would be much more, and maybe some folks on this call know more about some of the work that's happened there. But I would imagine it's more of a mixed severity fire regime. You're probably going to have certainly lower fire frequency, but when it does burn, maybe sort of more patchiness in some cases, and also some underburning, higher force density in general. That's what we see from the El Dorado 1920 study, definitely higher force density and definitely higher canopy cover. So I would not probably be as comfortable, very comfortable at taking what we've learned here to go up in that fur area.
Thank you.
Thank you, Gwen. I'll turn to you. Have a comment in the chat.
Yeah, thank you for your time and your presentation. I was wondering whether you did any biological monitoring, particularly birds or bumblebees, with respect to treatment, and if so, what was the response?
No, thank you for that question. You know, we did do 100% inventory as best we could of songbird nesting. And we also did a comprehensive survey of small mammals. And we actually did another survey of ground beetles. So all the beetles that basically live in the forest floor and the duff and litter. And these are all dissertations that were done. And all of them essentially found that there were some quick changes to the community structure. But all three of them, the beetles, the songbirds, and the small mammals, came to the conclusion that the treatments created relatively ephemeral changes, and really what those people all did the studies of significant ecological changes. Of course, we didn't do things like California spotted owl, which is a home range. It's well above our experimental design, so we didn't do anything about that at all. We did have some carnivore camera traps. So we saw a little increase in carnivore camera traps. We saw a slight increase in jackrabbit population of all things because of the opening in the stands. But we really did try, and I didn't say that very clearly, and I should have early, that the goal was to really look at, as much as we could, the ecological outcomes. It included an extensive soil survey, both compaction and nutrients, small mammals and songbirds, this insects that included bark beetles and also ground nesting beetles, the ground beetles. We also did invasive plants, trying to look at invasive species. And we even did a social science component where we had maybe around 500 different people come out here and actually view the stands shortly after treatment to get their ideas of whether or not they thought it was reasonable, not, or other aspects as well. So as best we could, the study really was designed to try to look at as much ecological factors as we could at the level of about 50-acre treatment unit.
Thank you for that.
Okay, thank you. Ben?
Scott, just looking at the picture and the slide that's still up, you burned and you had the deer brush response that was significant, and then you burned again and it still came back, and then this is the third time.
Yeah.
And it's looking like it's maybe like 10% cover. So do you think that that's going to be the stable condition, or are we going to see, if we don't burn enough or frequently enough, are we going to see that deer brush just come back like gangbusters? And I don't see much other diversity in the understory. Do you see, what's the long-term response of the understory here? And do you think the deer brush is going to come back, or can we convert to bear clover? And we just speak more to the long-term, how we manage this site. Are we going to have to burn every 3 years or whatever it is, or every 5 years in order to do this? Or just talk more about that, please.
No, that's a really interesting question, and it's not an easy one. We do have full understory shrubs here. We do have things like Sierra Rose. We have Manzanita here. The ceanothus is dominant here. We also have some other areas where we have dominant whitethorn. So we have whitethorn in some areas versus the deer brush. And it's an interesting question about, I think there is going to be a significant component of this shrub understory that persists. Again, our pre-treatment data from these stands showed less than 2% cover of any understory plants. And, now, like you said, maybe we got 10, 15%. I even forgotten the number. I could look it up. But we're seeing this patchy kind of structure of shrubs in the understory, maybe based on more gaps, maybe a little aspect, south aspect, of course, a little bit higher. And, we're thinking about this place maybe reburned every, maybe 15, 20 years. It could be shorter or maybe a little longer based on objectives. And I would just say it's probably now in some sort of maintenance mode, potentially. If it was a remote area, maybe you just let lightning fire burn in here if you could. That would probably be very desirable. That way you could kind of check this one off in terms of you trying to do active maintenance, and you could go maybe work someplace else and let a natural process maintain it. But of course, we're not going to do that at Blodgett. We got too many neighbors. We got Quintet, a little town next door. So we're not going to do that. But I do think that in this realm now, we're just going to see these patches of shrubs persist in these systems. And the diversity is a question that I should be able to answer a little better than I am right now. But I can't answer that question as well as I probably would like to. I apologize for that.
Thank you. Sarah?
Yeah, this is John Buckley. Good morning, Scott. So I have a couple questions, but the first one is, so when you were early on showing a historic untreated forest inventory site, you were describing it as being roughly 25% canopy cover over 40 acres. And again, there were questions from Ben and others as whether that's representative, but that was in mixed conifer and pine, I believe, and somewhat lower elevation. Then you were showing there that at Blodgett, which is such a great place, and I agree that when we can visit there on site, there's always so much to learn from presentations there. But at that site, you were talking about a particular treatment dropping canopy cover from 75 to 55%. And based on that particular treatment, it didn't do enough to really reduce the fire severity risk based on modeling. Then you shifted into talking about a goal not to have homogeneous conditions, and all of this ties back to you and Malcolm and Brandon and everybody trying to get ICO conditions, those individual clumps and openings. So with that in mind, and it may be something you're going to address later in your PowerPoint, but with that in mind, when we're looking at variation across the landscape, but we're still trying to get to a canopy condition that benefits as much as possible closed canopy species, but also we're trying to reduce fire risk. Do you have some general observations you found from your treatments and also looking at the rimfire and others as to if you're trying to apply some sort of limits or conditions, is there some objective that you see that is kind of the sweet spot?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and it's a challenging one. I guess I would say a few things. You're right. When we look at that pine mixed conifer site on the Stanislaus and we use FES at a 40-acre scale, we get around 25, 27% canopy cover. With the highest cover of the 40 acres, I think that we had was 45%. So I think 45% was the highest canopy cover for a 40-acre lot. Of course, there's going to be a lot of variation in that 40 acres, right? But that 25% was the average. If we go down to the Kern, which is in the Greenhorn Mountains now part of the Sequoia National Forest, there we actually had a bigger elevational gradient. We actually had higher elevation down to pine dominated only. And there, we actually saw lower canopy cover in the pine dominated ponderosa pine, a little higher actually up in the mixed conifer, maybe in the low 30s. But still, in that Greenhorn area, canopy cover average on a 40-acre unit was around 28, 25%. You know what? You go down to the Sierra San Pedro Martir today, another place that if you ever wanted to visit, I'd really encourage you to go. You take canopy cover measurements down there, you know what it is? 28%. And it varies from around 10, 15 to 50. So, John, your question is a really good one, and it's not easy. This idea of what are we shooting for land management, I don't have all the answers by no means, okay? But I would say that based on what I know now and anticipated climate change impacts of continued drying, more aridity, more frequent fire headed our way, I think my view is, we've just written about this in a paper recently, we got the historical range of variation, which I think helps us understand where we are in all the system. My view is maybe we start to think about the historical range of variation and we start looking at that range, and we maybe point more towards the low end of the historical range of variation, thinking that that might help us persist in a climate change environment, in an environment with more stressors. We still need variation. We still need clumps of high areas of trees. Malcolm North published a very important paper a few years ago to say it was really not just the overall canopy cover, but it was really the persistence of large trees that actually seemed to be more important to California spotted owl nesting. another piece of information. But I wonder if we could, instead of looking at the whole range of variation and maybe looking at more homogeneous prescriptions, which like what we did here at Blodgett somewhat, maybe we look at the more low end of the historical range of variation and we look at how we might be able to create that with some areas of high crown density and other aspects. But boy, do I have, I'm sure there's going to be others that are going to have different ideas. And so I can't say that. That's just my opinion, you know, and what I've thought about in the last 20 years.
Thanks, Scott. And then the second question was, so as you've probably seen in many places on the Stanislaus and the rim fire, it's not just deer brush that's come back thick, but especially chokecherry and some areas just absolutely impenetrable thickets now, whitethorn, that again, even if mastication can be a challenge at times to work with. And the experience that I've seen is where there have been some areas burned, it doesn't do as effective a job as you're showing with this picture here with the deer brush, especially in the whitethorn and in the chokecherry. Have you at Blodgett done mechanical type treatments or herbicide type treatments to try and knock back that, you know, I'll call it ladder fuel. It's not much of one, but it's so consistent underneath, and to get the diversity back into the stand that Greg Suba was asking about, because in some of those areas on the rim fire, literally, I'll bet they're bigger than 40-acre blocks of nothing but either whitethorn or chokecherry underneath some of the high severity burn stands of dead trees.
You know, John, another good question. Our study didn't use herbicides, you know, so that's one thing that we did not include based on just what we had put out in early 2000s. I still think that they could be effective in spot herbicide application for some of this that you're talking about. We do have whitethorn. Compartment 180 is actually a whitethorn compartment, and it's a mechanical plus fire unit. So we could actually show you that someday. It's been more difficult. So it has been more difficult. We did a full mastication on that before we did that second mechanical plus fire burn. The masticator was able to do a pretty good job, but then I showed you that picture afterwards that we actually caused more damage to the residual stand. So I think what that tells me is, and this is not going to be easy, is you got to get in early. You know, once you get, you know, canopy covers or shrub covers 60, 80% or higher, holy Toledo, have you taken down maybe your options? You know, so you probably got to get in there early, maybe use some of the surface fuel to deaden down wood, break up those shrubs with fire or whatever you're going to do, maybe do some spot herbicide. I think once you get that really continuous cover of shrubs, it is hard. And then it's hard to burn in it. That's my experience. Even if you do a mastication, the flammability of that system is still high. So it probably tells you maybe if you do mastication, you got to wait more time than we did and try to see if that can get some decomposition into it. But I guess the big issue would be trying to head it off before it happens.
Thank you.
Thanks, John. I'm going to go to Thurman Roberts in the chat and then to Randy. Thurman?
Hi there. I was just wondering, with a lot of the prescriptions that you're showing, the fire, there tends to be a lot of the brush grow back. And I was just wondering, the trees are often burned. For bioenergy and biomass facilities, how do you see the prescriptions affecting that community in terms of viability, fuel viability, and procurement?
So you're thinking that if, you know, maybe that pre-treatment stand, instead of doing that burn, we do a biomass operation, take that material off site versus them and don't use fire at all? Is that what you're asking?
Kind of. And then like some of the material that we're running into in the ground with the stands are a lot of the smaller trees, small diameter trees. And so I'm just trying to get at how do we find that balance with bioenergy and current low densities within the forest and the prescriptions you're talking of?
Well, you're right. I mean, the prescription certainly would have to be grounded in the place you are, you know, and of course I showed you here a very high density forest, and it's a relatively it's a very productive forest, you know. So, you know, the bioenergy thing to me just gives me, for me, it's an exciting option because you might be able to do some of that work. Even if you were able to do, let's say, a whole tree harvest or some other treatment here, take some of those crowns back to a landing, take the material to the sawmill, you can make lumber out of it, then you shred the material, you chip it right there, and then you basically take it to a bioenergy plant or some other use. But then you come in and you do some burning afterwards. You know, if you came in and did some burning afterwards, just the natural fuels will give you a shrub response. So there's no doubt you would get a shrub response by just burning the natural fuels. I think in our treatment, you know, since we didn't take anything out, we actually then caused residual damage to the stands. And maybe I know we're getting close, I think, to the end, but I'm going to show you one picture here. I'm going to go, this picture I just wanted to show you just for a moment. This is actually a diagram of just the burn units. So we're only talking about the 3 prescribed fires. So this is a paper that was just published by Jacob Levine recently. It's Levine et al. 2020. If you ever want any of these papers, you can just send me an email. I'm happy to send you any of them. But Jacob did a nice job of looking at the consumption of the fires at Blodgett, just the fire onlys. And you see that the green is the first fire consumption, the orange is the second, the blue is the third. One thing that jumps out really, really remarkably is so much more variation in the consumption in the third fire. That third fire consumption was more than variation in terms of, you know, the patchiness. Some areas unburned, some areas 10-hour fuels remain, some areas 100-hour fuels remain, some areas the coarse wood remains. When we got to that third fire, the amount of variation in most structural attributes really, really increased. I think it's a emergent property of the ecosystem, you know, developing some of that heterogeneity itself. Versus in the first fire, of course, you got so much high fuel loads, they're so continuous, not much variation. Second one, maybe intermediate. The third, the highest variation in fuels. And here's a picture I wanted to show you that maybe goes at your question a moment. So Danny Foster just published a paper, just came out in Ecosphere, on the carbon dynamics of these stands after the third fires. So here we see a bar graph, and we see control, mechanical, burn, mech burn. So those are the 3 treatments we had, right? And each is replicated 3 times. So there's 12 experimental units, each around 50 acres or so. So if you look at this graph, the bars at the back that are relatively light colored are the stocks, the carbon stocks, megagrams of carbon per hectare. So it's just amount of carbon per hectare. The bars in the front are what we call the stable carbon, the carbon that relatively stable because of its, you know, it's in big trees. It's going to have less maybe on the ground in terms of surface fuel. So this shows us against, you know, an idea of just how the treatments vary in terms of stability of carbon. And I want to show you one last picture, then you can please ask questions. Now this graph is a little more, has a few more variables. We'll spend just a moment on it. It's still got the same treatments. You see them: control, mechanical, burn, mechanical, burn. So it's got the same treatments we've been talking about. At the bottom though, you see the annual wildfire probability. So that's the probability of a wildfire hitting your site. For a lot of years, the mixed conifer zone of the Sierra Nevada, Sue Hasari used to be the fire management officer for the Forest Service. Sue used to tell us number of years ago in the 90s, the annual probability of fire in California's mixed conifer Sierra Nevada was around 0.5%, 0.5%, about a 0.5% a year, okay? More recent work from Carlin Stars and others have shown that the probability of wildfire has gone up in some forest types to around 2.5 to 3. So we're going up from about 0.5% a year probability of wildfire, now currently maybe around 2 to 3%. The other aspects of this graph that I could send you the paper you could read on is, one of them is how much of the carbon actually gets emitted by the wildfire immediately. Of course, you can burn a whole forest, but you still got a lot of carbon afterwards in big stems. You're not burning up big stems even in the worst wildfire. You saw it, big old snags out there, right? So that's one aspect of this graph. The other aspect is if you take wood off the site, how long is that carbon sequestered for maybe 25 to 50 years? That's another factor that's in this graph. You get down to the end of the day, the 4 upper quadrants with the little dotted lines around them, those we believe are the closest to what is happening today. So that's what we think is the best representation of the carbon kind of accounting with wildfire risk in there. And a couple of things surprise you a little bit, surprise me. One thing is look at the two graphs that are essentially at the bottom, but they're relatively flat, aren't they? So you see the flat graphs are both the orange and the yellow. What are those? Those are the mechanical burn and the burn treatments. They don't have as much carbon in them, about 200 to 175 megagrams per hectare, but it really doesn't matter what the probability of wildfire is it? It's flat. So as those probabilities of wildfire go up all the way up to maybe 0.99% per year, the fire treatments are holding on to the carbon they got. And that's not surprising because the fire treatments take away the surface fuel and they take away the ladder fuel. So that basically they're very stable when it comes to repeat burning, repeat burning, repeat burning. But look at the others. The other ones are pink and blue. So the pink and blue lines are the control and mechanical treatment. One thing that surprised me in this analysis is even at 2.5 to 3% annual probability of wildfire, the control treatments are doing pretty good because at that percentage of wildfire occurrence, we're still not seeing the discounting of that carbon as much as it could be. And the other thing you see there is the mechanical treatment is doing pretty good too. So the mechanical treatment's doing pretty good as well from a carbon accounting standpoint. Now I'm going to give you one caveat. The caveat is we believe that when we do this analysis, we have to estimate fire behavior and effects in these stands. And we think that the fire behavior system underestimates the severity of wildfire in control conditions. So if our fire behavior system underestimates wildfire severity in control conditions, that probably means that blue line that's above most of those other lines, which are the control, is probably inflated. But the other thing that pops out to this that surprised me is the mechanical treatment, the restoration mechanical treatment as applied at Blodgett is doing a pretty good job from a carbon accounting standpoint. It's also doing a pretty good job from a fire hazard standpoint. So what's this mean to me? I just think it means you use the treatment that makes sense to your ground. You know, sometimes I hear folks say that we shouldn't use this treatment because of this reason. We shouldn't use this treatment because of this reason. I think they're all basically desirable in some areas. So I just feel, in my view, that we go at the question and we try to make, you know, the best decisions we can based on local objectives and other aspects, markets, costs, whatever. But I just think that it shows, at least this work shows that I think the treatments can be effective and they have different attributes. But no, I wouldn't say there's a loser there. But I guess it tells me that there are options. Maybe I'll stop there for a minute.
Randy, your hand is up.
Okay, thanks. And thank you, Dr. Stevens, for being here. I got two quick questions. One of them was you brought up when you were answering John Buckley's questions, you said get in early. What does early mean?
That's a great question. I think early would be within 10 years. You know, maybe between 5 and 10 years, I would say is early. I think that's the response time you probably got for shrubs starting to really make a comeback. So if you're going to go in there, go ahead.
Well, the other part of the question was when I heard you speak at Scale last year, and you talked about frequency of fire on the landscape and when it was safe and when it wasn't safe to do that. I think that's an important part of the question. I'd like you to elaborate on that. But if you use fire as maintenance, which is my real question, how soon do you have to get back on?
Yeah. I think at least for the Blodgett site, if your interest is really more of a fire hazard, keeping fire hazard at a level that when it does burn in a wildfire, probably conserves the forest long-term, keeps big trees, creates some patchiness, but you basically got a forest ecosystem. I think you could do it at Blodgett at 20-year interval. You know, I think you could go back about every 20 years or so. I mean, that's, again, maybe you do a little earlier for other values, maybe a little later, but you probably got 20 years or so, especially after that third fire. You know, you don't have that after the first. You got to get back in there earlier on the first and even the second. You saw it, you know, all those dead trees standing. They've got to be taken care of. So I bet you once you get to the third, you probably got 20, 25 years. But the first two, you got less, probably about 10. That'd be my value.
Thank you.
Thanks, Penny. And Ben?
Yeah, Scott, as an NRCS forester, we spend a lot, we don't have the ability to modify canopy cover as one of our treatments. We typically focus on, less than 10-inch diameter and treating shrubs and surface fuels. Are we doing that all for nothing? Since we keep talking about canopy cover, how important are the different fuel types to forest resilience and, and the difference between forest health versus wildfire healthy forests versus, bark beetle resistant forests?
That is a bloody awesome question, because, and it's really important. I believe from science in the last 20, 30 years that the fuels question has really been solved. The fuels question about trying to keep fire behavior at a lower rate, trying to basically have more efficient wildfire suppression response. If you're in a forest, you've got a few layers: surface layer, ladder layer, you got a ground fuel layer, and you also got canopy. I would say that 60 to 70% of the issue is all on the surface fuel. That's unfortunate, because I know it's not valuable, but that's where the energy is. There's so much energy in that surface fuel layer: 30 tons an acre, 40 tons an acre, 15 tons an acre. It's a lot of energy in that surface layer. Maybe 25% of the hazard is in the ladder fuel. Maybe some places 40%, 25, 40% the ladder fuel. You're talking about the tall shrubs and small trees. The overstory, maybe 5%. There's no doubt that maybe you want to thin a stand for something like firefighter safety and a fuel break, something like that. But from a fire hazard standpoint, the overstory has got maybe 5% of the hazard. The ground fuel layer, the duff on the top of the soil, 0. And doesn't have any aspect of fire behavior. So I think your question is a good one. If you want to reduce potential fire behavior and effect, you target surface fuels and ladder fuels, you are effective. Now the question about resiliency, bark beetles, climate adaptation, this is really interesting. I would say there that the things we just talked about are grounded and true, but then you start talking about forest density, species composition. Do you have too much of one species that's going to maybe increase your vulnerability, something like a scolitis attack or maybe a dendroctonus attack, bark beetles? Do you have, conditions that are basically set up for maybe potential just mortality because of drought and increased temperature? So that's when I would say we go into this notion of the historic range of variation, and maybe we emphasize the lower range of historic range of variation for maybe half the land, and then maybe think about another creative combination for maybe the other half, higher canopy values, the patchiness nature. And it's really, unfortunately, that the latter piece, the resilience piece you're asking about, we can't run Farsight. We can't run Flam Map. We can do that for the fire side, and we can get some ideas of what's working and what's not. But the models that are trying to incorporate things like patchiness, different densities, different species compositions, different sizes, enhancing large trees and actually maybe reducing smalls, much more difficult to get a quantitative model to do that. Just as a fortuitous, but we actually have a paper right now in the second round of review in Bioscience, 11 authors, I'm the lead on it. The title is Fuel Reduction and Restoration, Convergence or Divergence. No kidding. So it's a question that we've been working on like crazy as a group, 11 of us, all over the Western US. And I think what you bring up as a question is so important, because I think it really does help us understand maybe what we're trying to achieve.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And so, Dr. Stevens, we are at time, but I'd like to allow you whatever time you need to wrap up your presentation.
Yeah, I'll just go to this last slide. So if you look at really the data, Hugh Safford and Jen Stevens wrote this paper in 2017. I bet you've seen it. It's a summary of mixed conifer forest, a Forest Service publication, General Technical Report. They say in there, tree density has increased around 2.75 times, 2 3/4 times since 1900. Overall canopy cover about 1.5 times based on what they reconstruct. Forest changes are changing resiliency. This is one thing I didn't talk about a lot, but I believe it wholeheartedly. Climate change makes this worse. It's not the biggest issue. The biggest issue is current conditions of forest structure. It's not climate change. Climate change is going to make things more difficult. Yes, it is. It's already making things more difficult. Sometimes I just feel that it's given like we have no options. We have big time options. Okay, so that's my view. What about Nathaniel Kenny? Imagination soar? You know what the answer is? fire back mechanical restoration treatments. So it's not going to be 43 new sensors, 12 different satellites looking down on top trying to find fires. I'm actually part of a team that's doing that. I just say it's more about a relationship with the land and people. We've got to get our systems back in a condition where fire, climate change, and other factors are going to be incorporated. It's all about us and the land. It's not just about this notion of more technology. That's my view. And what's going on in California? Well, I have to say there's some optimism. You know, we got, funding that are coming from CAL FIRE grants, $200 million a year roughly. We actually have people that are doing great work on the ground. I think one thing I would love to see is a fire extension program statewide that would be able to engage people from San Diego to Modoc counties. Have people that are trained in fire restoration, fire and wild and urban interface, fire and indigenous cultures. You know that varies through this state. It varies tremendously. Have a person that maybe is in a county that has a 2-county area, a little like what we've done for agriculture in the cooperative extension model for 75 years in this state, which has worked tremendously. People that have been working on agriculture, taking information to stakeholders, taking information to city councils, boards of supervisors. Agriculture has been working so well. I think we need to do that same thing for fire statewide. Have people that actually are going to be full-time working with 2 counties. They're facilitating what we're doing today, facilitating discussions, helping homeowners groups, and then just really thinking about how to move forward. I think it's time to do that statewide. There's been discussion of that in the state. It hasn't happened yet. Prescribed Fire Training Center. I think if we want to really start to think about doing prescribed fire at the scale we're talking about, we need to get more people trained to do this. I've been to the Tallahassee, Florida one for many years. That Tallahassee, Florida Prescribed Fire Training Center is remarkable. What it's achieved over the decades is nothing less than incredible. It's open 24/7. They have substitutes in Alabama, South Carolina. They basically have these little nodes that they go work in. People get certified. Private people can become certified prescribed burners. All this goes on. There's 4 full-time employees at that site. 4 full-time federal employees at that site. I think it's time to get one in the West somewhere. And then this idea of pace and scale treatment. Craig Thomas has really been talking about this idea of community college education to maybe increase a workforce in restoration and burning. I think that's a great idea that Craig's championed for a number of years. And maybe you saw that Senator Feinstein put a bill out about 10 days ago, 2 weeks ago on fire in the United States. And those 3 things are included. Certainly there's other things that maybe cause a little more distress to some people. But I would just say that Feinstein's bill does have those 3 things in there. And I find that a little bit encouraging. So I'm optimistic. I'm an optimistic person that we could do this work. I really am. But I have to say that we don't have decades and decades. We're not in the Harry Biswell time. We're in the time of real changes happening right before our eyes. So that's why I say 1 to 2 decades are absolutely critical to change the rudder on this giant ship. Change the rudder on this ship to start to say we're doing something long-term for the long-term conservation of these systems. I'm still hopeful. I'm very hopeful. But I'm also a little bit worried. I'll leave it there.